To install the TeraFlex coilover brackets and Falcon 3.3 coilover shocks for the JL Wrangler, you need to first assess your vehicle and build. This video assumes that you will be installing on a stock vehicle that has no previous modifications, but if you are watching this video, we should also assume that you are contemplating installing this kit on your own Jeep, so it's more than likely that your vehicle will have some modifications done to it. To install the TeraFlex coilover brackets, it is required that you have long arms on your vehicle, which can be installed in tandem with the coilover bracket kit. TeraFlex's coilover RT long arm kit includes the essential components to install the coilover shocks on a stock Rubicon Wrangler or Wrangler with aftermarket axles. A video detailing how to install the long arms is already available, and that info will not be provided here. This kit is designed to be installed using TeraFlex's axles. Because of their thicker axle tubes and upgraded housing, they are ideal to handle the change to coilover shocks. However, brackets for the Rubicon 44 axle are also available, but a 44 axle will require wheel spacers. Included in the written instructions is a guide to determine how much wheel spacer will be needed, depending on your axle width, wheel offset, and tire width. Your inside tire to inside tire width must be 58.5 inches or greater. Installing coilover shocks onto your Jeep is a big job and requires a lot of time. It is highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety and read the written instructions thoroughly before starting the installation process. If you have any questions about what has been said already or the process going forward, please reach out to the TeraFlex customer service team. To remove the axles, lift the vehicle off the ground and remove the tires. If you have frame-mounted rock sliders, like you see in the video here, then you can use those as lift points. If you are installing the long arm brackets at the same time, then avoid using body mounts for this install. Remove the front sway bar links, these will be replaced. Disconnect the front track bar from the axle. If you are replacing it, then feel free to remove it. Disconnect the drag link from the knuckle. If you don't already have an HD drag link, you can remove the drag link entirely. Remove the front brake calipers and hang them off to the side. Don't hang them by the brake line. Remove the rotor. Stock rotors have a small bolt holding it in place. Remove the backing plate. Disconnect the ABS sensor. Remove the bracket connecting the ABS line to the top of the knuckle. Disconnect the axle actuator plug on the right side of the axle. Detach the wires anywhere they connect to the axle. If you have electronic lockers, then you will also need to disconnect the locker actuator plug. Disconnect the vent hose. Support the axle and remove the front shocks. Remove and discard the brake line brackets from the lower control arms and spring mounts by first prying open the bracket and carefully removing the brake lines. Then detach and discard the brackets. Remove the front drive shaft. This will need to be replaced. The coilover shocks will change the pinion angle, so even with factory Rubicon axles, new drive shafts will be needed. The front upper control arms are covered by a heat shield on the frame end. Feel free to move this out of the way and remove it entirely. Loosen the bolts on the control arms. Lower the axle enough to remove the springs. Double check to make sure all brake lines, ABS lines, sensors, hoses, and plugs are disconnected from the front axle and control arms. To remove the axle, we will lower it down onto the table, which has wheels so we can move the table around. If you don't have a table like we do, then you can use jack stands. Remove the lower arms from both the axle and the frame. Disconnect the upper arms from the axle. At this point, the axle is disconnected, so the vehicle can be lifted up, or the axle moved out of the way if you're not using a lift. Remove the upper control arms from the frame end. On the passenger side of vehicles with an e-torque, there is an auxiliary coolant pump which will need to be moved out of the way to access the bolt. In the rear of the vehicle, disconnect the lower end of the rear sway bar links from the axle and remove the rear sway bar. This needs to be replaced by an aftermarket relocated rear sway bar, which should come with its own rear sway bar links. Detach the rear calipers and hang them out of the way. Disconnect the ABS line. Remove the rear drive shaft. This will need to be replaced with the aftermarket drive shaft on reinstallation. Remove the bracket connecting the emergency brake cables to the body. Pull down on the e-brake line and clamp the locking pliers onto the eyelet. Disconnect the e-brake line, leave the locking pliers in place until you reinstall the e-brake lines. Using pliers, detach the e-brake line from the axle. Feed the emergency brake lines up over the cross members so that the lines will travel under the cross member once they are reattached to the axle. Remove the rear track bar. Remove the breather hose and locker actuator plug if needed. Support the axle and remove the shocks. To access the upper end of the rear shock, remove the small section of the inner fender liner by removing the 3 screws holding it in place. It will not be reinstalled. Loosen all the control arm bolts. Raise the vehicle or lower the axle until the springs are loose and remove the springs. Set the axle onto a table or jack stands and remove the control arms from both the frame and the axle end. The axle should now be free to be moved out of the way. Installing coilover brackets onto the axles requires that you cut off certain factory brackets. This is best done with a plasma cutter, but a cutoff wheel or body saw will also get the job done. On the front Rubicon axle, cut off the spring mount bracket and then the shock mount bracket. The axle tube needs to be smooth to attach new coilover brackets. Make sure that the axle's powder coat is removed from the areas where you will be welding. On the rear Rubicon axle, remove the shock mount and sway bar link off the lower control arm mounting bracket. If you have TeraFlex's axles, then you will need to remove the same brackets on the front and rear, but the installation of the new rear brackets will be a little different. To install the front shock brackets, on the driver's side, attach the alignment bracket to the sway bar link mount, where it aligns with the underside of the mount. Attach the alignment brackets to the track bar mount on the passenger side. It will be flush along the top with the top of the track bar bracket. Set the shock bracket into place on the passenger side. A notch on the bracket positions it correctly to the alignment bracket. The alignment bracket should be nested against the outside of the notch. On the front Rubicon axles, the welds on the knuckle might prevent the bracket from sitting flat. If this is the case, you can grind a little off the bracket until it sits flat. Tack the shock bracket into place and double check that it is sitting correctly on the axle tube. If everything looks good, weld the bracket on completely. Repeat the process for the driver's side. The alignment bracket will line up with the outside of the notch on the bracket. When you switch sides, make sure you move the ground so it is on the same side that you are welding. Do not allow the ground to go through the carrier. After both shock brackets are welded on, you can install the bump stop brackets. These go on top of the axle exactly 90 degrees from the track bar bracket. On Rubicon axles, the brackets sit 2 inches in from the knuckle. On Terra 60 axles, these will be 2 5/16 from the knuckle. It is important that these sit correctly on the axle so the TeraFlex speed bump can properly absorb the bump. Tack the bracket on and double check everything is located correctly. If it's good, then weld on the bracket. On the rear axle, the brackets for the Rubicon are attached with the provided control arm hardware. Make sure the bracket sits flush with the bottom of the control arm mount so that the sides of the bracket are pushed in against the outside of the control arm mounts, but not so tight that it causes the control arm mount to be pinched. Weld the brackets on, but don't weld the bolt. You will need to remove it to attach the control arm. For the rear Terra CRD 60 axles, the brackets don't attach in the same way. Press the bracket in from the outside of the lower control arm mount, then align the bottom of the bracket with the bottom of the lower control arm mount. Finally, press the tab against the flat surface of the lower control arm mount. Tack the bracket in place and double check that it looks good. Then weld on the bracket. Do not weld the bottom of the bracket so water can drain. Once you have all the axle brackets welded on and they have cooled properly, prime and paint the axles using good etching primer and a few coats of black enamel paint. To install the brackets onto the frame, some frame and body modifications are needed. Starting in the rear, disconnect the sensor plug and move it out of the way. You can reconnect it after the brackets are installed. Measure in on the pinch weld just behind the shock mount 4.5 inches from the outside and then up from the bottom 1 inch. Draw a box around this area. This will be trimmed off. Measure up 1 inch on the small curved bit of the pinch weld and mark the edge and draw a line from the corner of the mark. Mark the shock mount on the inside 1/4 inch from the bottom as shown here. Using the provided spacer, set it with the bolt inside up against the outside of the shock mount. Tighten down the bolt and use it to trace a curve from the bottom of the mount. Use a body saw or cutoff wheel to trim the places you have marked. When trimming the shock mount, you will connect the line you cut on the inside of the curve you marked to the outside. It's easier to do this part with a grinder. Once everything is cut, smooth over the sharp edges. test fit the coilover bracket. If the bracket fits, then temporarily attach it using the provided hardware. Make sure it's pressed firmly against the body mount. Use a center punch and mark where the 2 holes go on the body mount. Remove the bracket and drill the holes in steps up to 7/16 inch. If you are installing on a diesel, you will need to relocate the DEF tank filler and breather hoses. Detailed instructions on how to do this can be found in the written instructions. Paint any exposed metal before installing the coilover bracket. Make sure the bracket presses firm against the body mount and final tighten the top bolt first before final tightening the rest of the hardware. Installing the front coilover brackets is considerably more complicated, so we left it for last. Start by removing all the clips, connectors, brackets, wire harnesses, and plugs that attach to the shock tower, spring bucket, and inner frame behind the shock tower and spring bucket. This is no small venture, and we suggest you take a picture of your vehicle prior to removing anything so that you can more or less figure out where it went. The hardware on the brake line bracket will need to be saved for use later, as will the hardware for the bracket holding the large plug. Tie up all the loose wires out of the way. On the back of the steering pump are 2 plugs that need to be disconnected. Unbolt the steering pump from the frame and push it back. On the driver's side, loosen the steering box bolts in front of the spring bucket and remove the bolts inside the spring bucket. These bolts will be replaced with new hardware, but retain the factory bolts because you will reuse them in different locations with the coilover brackets. If you have a diesel or 392, you will need to remove the airbox. The airboxes for the 2 trims are different, but they pretty much are removed the same way, even though stuff is in different places. Disconnect the plug and loosen the clamp. And remove the bolts holding it in place. Then lift it straight up. You need to trim the rearmost corner of the airbox. The diesel has a cover that adheres to the airbox to cover up the trimmed corner, but on the 392 this is not needed. While you have the airbox removed, remove the airbox mounting bracket by disconnecting the clips and removing the bolts. Cut off the rear half of the bracket just behind the second rubber mount, as indicated on the screen. Smooth over any sharp corners and paint the exposed metal. Reinstall the front of the bracket onto the vehicle and discard the rear section, then reinstall the trimmed airbox. On the two e-torque trims and the 4xe, you will need to remove the coolant pump located on the driver's side shock tower. This coolant pump will be relocated and mount on the underside of the steering box. Unfortunately, the process for relocating the pumps is different for each vehicle trim, so it can get a little confusing. This video shows the process with explanations for all three trims that require this. Disconnect the wire harness connector from the pump and then the pump from the lines. On the 3/6 e-torque and the 2/0 e-torque, keep the soft lines with the pump and disconnect the soft lines from the hard lines. On 4xe, disconnect the pump from the soft lines and leave the soft lines where they are. Assemble the hoses as shown. On the 3/6 and 2/0 e-torque, the ends without a fitting will attach to the hard lines and the connector end will attach to the soft lines that are attached to the pump. On the 4xe, this is inverted, so the ends without a fittings attach directly to the pump and the end with a fitting attaches to the soft lines. Before you attach the hoses, take the pump and loosen the bolt on the clamp. If this bolt is the bottom of the clamp, then rotate the pump a third of the way around until the vertical tube is pointing up. On the 3/6 e-torque, with the side with the plug facing forward, rotate it clockwise. On the 2/0 e-torque and 4xe, rotate the pump counterclockwise. Attach the bracket to the steering box. On the 2/0 e-torque and 4xe, use the provided hardware to attach the bracket and then the pump to the bracket. On the 3/6 e-torque, remove the old bracket and disconnect the rubber mount from it. Attach the rubber mount to the new bracket before installing it. Both pumps will then attach to the new bracket. A thick washer will sit in between the new bracket and the metal clamp when it attaches with the provided hardware. Make all the hose connections. On the 3/6 e-torque and the 2/0 e-torque, the hose assembly with the 90-degree connectors will attach to the horizontal hard line. And then the soft line connected to the vertical tube on the pump. The straight tube will connect to the hard line pointing down. This will then connect to the other soft line connected on the back of the pump. Once the hoses are connected, use the provided zip ties to tie the hoses to each other and to the other hoses in the engine bay. Make certain the hoses do not rub on the fan belt. Remember to refill the coolant reservoir. Run the engine for about 15 minutes to get the air out of the lines and fill the reservoir again. Check the level for about the first week and add coolant as needed. If you are cutting off the front shock tower and the spring mount with a plasma torch, cover any remaining brake lines and wire harnesses that could not be moved entirely out of the way with soaking wet rags. Cut carefully and use a metal backing plate to prevent sparks from going into the engine bay. Doing it in stages is helpful and makes it easier to get the tools in behind the spring bucket. You only need to cut the spring bucket until it is flush with the outside of the frame. Nothing mounts up there in the hole of the bucket, it will be hidden behind the coilover bracket. But if you desire a cleaner look, you can remove this section on top of the frame. Just be extra careful to not cut into the brake lines. Grind away the remaining metal from the brackets. The outside face of the frame should be smooth. The next step is drilling, but on the 392, the oil filter and housing are in the way of where you need to drill, so these should be removed. Remove the filter, unbolt the housing, and disconnect the housing. Make sure you cover the exposed parts of the engine while you are drilling to prevent contaminants from entering the oil system. You can either drain the oil or clamp the hoses going to the oil filter housing. In either case, you will lose some oil, so make sure you have some replacement oil. Reinstall the housing and filter after drilling. Starting on the inside of the passenger side of the frame, place the provided template over the 3 existing holes. Mark the size of the 2 top holes and remove the template. Drill out the bottom hole to 3/4 inch. It's too tight to fit a drill up to drill out the other holes, so using a rotary tool to enlarge the holes to the sizes you've marked using the template is a better option. The diameter of the left hole needs to be 3/4 inch and the right hole needs to be 7/8 inch. Test fit the inner bracket and adjust the holes as needed. On the inside of the driver's side, there is one existing hole that gets enlarged to 7/8 inch. You can do this with a drill. Test fit the bracket here as well. Place the same template on the outside of both driver and passenger sides of the frame and mark a hole in the part of the frame that dips a bit, but don't drill the hole yet. Set the coilover bracket into place using the 2 bolts on the right to hold it up. Align the small hole on the bottom corner with the hole on the frame. Then mark the center of the 2 holes on the frame. Before you remove the frame, make sure the hole that you marked with the template is in the correct location. Remove the bracket and drill all 3 holes. The hole you marked with the template goes to 1/2 inch, and the other 2 holes are drilled to 11/16 inch. This process is the same for both the driver and the passenger side. Install the passenger bracket. Remember the 2 bolts you removed from the steering box? One of them is going to slide into the inner bracket from the inside of the frame. Use the provided hardware to attach the rest of the bracket. A flag nut is installed through the large hole found rearward from the bracket. If your vehicle is 2023 or newer, you will need to remove the small bit of tire deflector bracket that covers the large hole on the passenger side. Place the small bolt in from the back of the coilover bracket. When we were filming, we failed to slide this in the way that we were supposed to, and so we just loosened all of the bolts and stuck it in while it was on the vehicle. On the driver's side, the outside bracket will install in mostly the same way, except the two provided long M12 bolts will go through the frame and into the steering box. The bracket that installs on the inside of the frame will reuse the other factory bolt that was removed from the steering box. Two nuts will be installed to hold the bracket onto the two bolts going through the steering box. Tighten these only after you have tightened the hardware from the outside. The brake line bracket will attach to the bracket using tiny bolts installed from behind the bracket. On the passenger side, the wire harness attaches to the bracket in two locations. Reuse the hardware you removed from the shock tower and the brake line bracket. You will need to heat up and bend the plastic piece where it attaches to the bracket. Attach the breather hose to the driver bracket using the button head zip ties. Install the speed bumps by applying RTV silicone to the speed bump body, slide it into the tube and attach the clamp on top. Clean off any silicone that got pushed off during installation. Attach the coilover speed bump spacers onto the axle bracket. The spacer configuration will be different depending on the tire sizes your vehicle will have. A tire clearance guide is included in the written instructions. Reinstall the axles onto the vehicle. If you are installing the JL long arms and the RT long arm suspension system at the same time, then install the rest of the components in the system or any aftermarket components that connect to the axle. Install the Falcon coilover shocks for the JL Wrangler. The installation is pretty straightforward. Attach the shock top and bottom using the hardware provided with the brackets. The rear upper shock has two sleeves that go into the upper joint. The front brake lines need to be swapped from one side to the other. This prevents the brake lines from stretching too far and getting caught in the coilover springs. Clamp the brake lines and disconnect them from the brake calipers. Disconnect the other end of the one brake line and transfer it quickly to the other side. If you have a friend to put their thumb on the brake line while you swap these lines, then that will prevent you from losing brake fluid. Make sure you replace the crush washers whenever you disconnect a brake line from the caliper. After the first brake line is attached, take the second back to the other side and attach it. Install the brake line anchor using hardware that was included with the coilover bracket. The anchor brackets are included with the RT long arm suspension system. Attach the anchor brackets to the ABS line and the brake line. The brake and ABS line should go behind the coilover shock and not touch the spring. Install the new 33-inch long rear brake lines that are included with the RT long arm suspension system. The installation of these is pretty easy. Clamp the brake line and disconnect it from the caliper. Install the new brake line onto the caliper using the new crush washers. Disconnect the upper end and attach new brake line. Attach the brake line anchor bracket to the axle where the factory brake line anchor bracket went, reusing the factory hardware. You will need to bleed the brakes. Detailed instructions for a manual brake bleed can be found in the written instructions. If you're installing 40-inch tires on your vehicle, be aware that there are numerous places where the 40-inch tires that we have tested rub. We recommend that you cycle your suspension with the tires on and check for rubbing. Resolve any issues before going off-road. The JL coilover kit is an upgrade unlike any other. You won't regret the amount of work involved to install it. Thanks for watching.